Hello, and welcome to the LVP Architects podcast. So this is the second recap in our podcast series, and this will recap on podcast 9, 10 and 11, I think it is. So procurement route, tender and building contract. The aim of these podcasts is, as I've mentioned from the beginning, is about sharing a bit of information regarding the part 3 exam, interview and case study. Obviously, for me, it's sharing that and tying in with a guide, obviously, that I've written and I mentioned previously, which is called The Unofficial Guide to the Architectural Part 3, which you can find on Amazon. And these podcasts are to add to that. And in the first recap, we spoke about the case study, project timeline, the brief, fee and program, appointment, and the CDM. So you should have, if you started this in order, then I recommended that you start with your case study and how you organise that, what you should look at. And in doing these podcasts, I've kind of realised that that we are, as an industry, visual as well. So what I've started to create on my YouTube channel, called LVP Architects, is snippets. So these video bites, as they were, are recapping podcasts, but in a visual format. I just think that would kind of help me if I was starting off as well. So listening to podcasts and seeing something visual, and then obviously having something written down. So we've gone through the case study. I won't repeat all the previous. Obviously, you can listen to recap 1, which I think was podcast 8. But I hope in listening to these and now seeing these video bites, it's slowly beginning to unravel that, yes, there is a lot of information to learn to become an architect. And after that point, you still are learning. Everything progresses. You go back 10 years, the REBA plan of works has changed. Just simply the naming of the stages has changed. So it's kind of, everything is always evolving in the aim for improving the industry as a whole. So even though you hopefully qualify, gain the title architect by registering with ARB, your education doesn't stop there. It continues in the forms of CPDs and more learning and the experience you gained in different construction techniques and methods. But in terms of the studying, hopefully it's becoming clear that there are these important topics that are all interlinked. And the idea is so that you can then at any moment almost sort of tie these topics together and be able to successfully answer any questions that come your way in the case study or exam, or indeed when you're an architect. So this recap, very briefly, is about the procurement route, tender and building contract. Those 3 things are intertwined. So the procurement route, as we mentioned before, is how you organise to get a building designed, constructed and handed over. So these procurement routes are, if you listen to podcast 9, I touch on there are many different types. There's traditional, D&B, management contracting, etc. And depending on the choice of that at the beginning is how the rest of those stages and when information is released and how these things are tendered and what types of building contracts are used are all tied together. So tenders, if it's a traditional, when does the tender occur, what information is required, to what level of detail. A D&B, it's, as was mentioned in podcast 10 about tenders, will require less information to a degree at the tender process compared to a traditional, and it's because of the level of details. Now obviously there are stages within that can be incorporated in those tenders, and again, like I mentioned, podcast 10 kind of delves into a little bit. None of these podcasts are giving you all the information. You still have to study them, you need to understand them, but hopefully the podcasts are kind of guiding you in a direction and connecting a few dots, so it kind of helps you understand where you should look and why. And then podcast 11 was about building contract. Again, the building contract is dictated by the procurement route. So a traditional building contract, and a building contract is between two parties, in most cases the client and the contractor. That client could be an organization, or it could be a person, or investors, and so forth. So understanding that client, understanding the building contract, which sets out clearly key elements so that there's no confusion as the building is being built by the contractor. It covers a lot of things, covers a lot of basic things at the beginning. Who's the contract between, the value of the works, start and finish date, any other information that is relevant, such as dispute resolutions at the end. And we'll touch on dispute resolutions in a later podcast. But hopefully it kind of shows you that when someone is talking about an appointment, it doesn't necessarily mean the building contract. So these are terms that you need to understand. So once again, procurement route dictates what type of tender you're going to have. What type of tender you're going to have will then afterwards, linked in with the procurement route, what type of building contract you'll end up with. And building contracts come in a variety of forms. REBA do forms of appointment, JCT and NEC do building contracts, and there are others as well. And then depending on the scale will dictate also with the procurement route what type of building contract you have. So a homeowner, very small building contract. When by small, obviously, I mean it's quite basic and simple, because the expected value of that project and the complexity is expected to be quite low. So you wouldn't need 500 pages of contract and clauses. And on that note, for your case study and exam and interview, you're not expected to memorize every single clause. You are expected to know that a homeowner's building contract isn't suitable for a university D&B project. You're supposed to understand that it's related to scale, and what are you trying to get out of it? What's key in those building contracts? So traditional standard contract in a traditional procurement route will have a timeline that has certain certifications that are needed at certain stages for sign-off and for payments and things like that. So it's understanding that's important. And it's important because you need to understand that your role, if you're appointed as a contract administrator, means that you will have to follow what's set out within that building contract and administrate it accordingly. If you're not appointed for that role, then still understanding in the background what is expected between those two parties at what time will help you be more efficient as well, and understand within the stages what's next and what's in the future. Okay, I think we'll stop there, as this is a recap. Hopefully it's cleared up a few things in respect of connections. If you're still unsure, you can go to the previous podcasts. Right, until the next podcast, where we'll talk about roles. Until then, thank you kindly for listening. Take care.